Ladies and gentlemen, could I ask everybody to take their seats? We're going to begin before frostbite sets in, so I'd ask everybody to take their seats. I think we're going to begin. My name is Jerry Green. I work at the Pacific Council. I want to welcome you to the first in-person event that we've had in quite some time. It's hard to catch a break. Last time we were here it was 110 and we all watched the butter melt. Today it's tundra weather, so it is what it is. But I'm really delighted to welcome you. We have many longtime members, a few guests, some new members, so we're really very pleased to have all of you. I want to begin and just say a quick word about Ukraine. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I want to leave time for our guests and discussion. But I think it's in keeping with our speaker's remarks today on global California, which I am enormously excited about. We should be attentive to events in Ukraine. They are as meaningful to us as they are to people on the East Coast or any place else. I've been asked repeatedly if anybody wants to help support the Ukrainian people. Well, the International Medical Corps, which is in LA, CEO's Nancy Ossie, one of our members, was designated by the New York Times as one of the 4 organizations to funnel aid to the Ukrainian people. So support the IMC, support California because they're here, and most importantly, support the Ukrainian people. My fear is things are going to get much worse there before they get better. This has started badly and is going to end even worse, but that's a conversation for another day. I want to welcome, I'm going to have to cheat and read a little bit because both of our speaker and our moderator have had such distinguished careers that I will either forget something, I will garble it. So forgive me for cheating. But I want to welcome our guest, Mariano-Florentino Cuellar, who goes by Tino, although I will probably call him Justice Cuellar because he was a member of the California Supreme Court. He's the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is the oldest think tank in America. It has branches all around the world. And when I was at RAND for many years, we all looked with great respect and admiration at Carnegie, to the point that a lot of my RAND colleagues are now at Carnegie doing really important work on our nation's capital. Before this, Justice Cuellar served as a justice on the Supreme Court of California, which is a remarkably important position. California has the 5th largest economy in the world. It is a city. LA is the city-state. California is like a country, except it's a state. And he's had a very diverse and interesting career. Before that, he was a professor at Stanford Law School. He directed the Freeman Spogli Institute, which in my world of strategic studies and geopolitics is an enormously respected place. He served 2 presidents in a variety of roles in the federal government, and was most recently a special assistant to the president for justice and regulatory policy at the White House. He chairs the board of the Hewlett Foundation, and essentially for us, the home of the Mexico Initiative at the Pacific Council, which we are very proud of. He was born in Matamoros, Mexico, and grew up primarily in communities along the border. Mexico for us is of special importance, and seeing someone who immigrated here from Mexico achieve such success merely furthers our resolve to to have immigration policy reform, and for us to realize that we're closer to Mexico City than we are to Washington. So Mexico for us is, we share a region, different countries, but same region. He is both a lawyer at Yale Law School, and I know there's a Yale Law School mafia here today, so you folks can all get up and do bula stuff that one of your own has actually, you've all made it, so yet another one of yours made it, and a PhD in political science from Stanford. So this is whatever they ate for breakfast at his house as a child is a diet we all should be following and feeding our children. I am also very pleased to introduce Miss Lindsey Kosberg, who is our interlocutor. Lindsey and I are old pals and Rand colleagues. We had offices that were very close to one another. She's currently the Senior Program and Community Engagement Director at the Smith Foundation, which is a private charitable foundation inspired by Eric Smith's commitment to opening doors of opportunity, advancing justice, promoting equality, safety, and so forth. Lindsey is originally, and she still is, she's an attorney. She has occupied a variety of senior positions at the Rand Corporation, which is where we first met, and has worked in the public sector at both the federal and the state level. And my immediate thought is, if we're going to talk about California, who better to engage in conversation than someone who actually knows California as well as Lindsey does. I want to welcome all of you. I want to turn the floor over to our guest and our interlocutor. We will have time at the end for questions. We should be distributing Patagonia North Face gear, so I wish I could control the weather. But anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you both.
Thank you, everybody. We are delighted to be here and to welcome an extraordinarily special guest. It is my honor to first let him talk to you for a few minutes, and then I will ask a few questions, and very excited to turn over and hear from all of you. It's a pleasure to welcome and put down the mic and hand it over to Justice Cuellar.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very honored to be here. Let me just start by noting that I've been asked by a number of you, actually, even in the last few minutes, why I left the Supreme Court of California to head an international think tank. And I'll just tell you in a nutshell, there I was, sitting in San Francisco in my chambers, waiting and waiting to be invited to speak at the Pacific Council for International Relations. And the phone never rang, notwithstanding that my friend Gabe Sanchez, who was a judge in the Ninth Circuit and was then a colleague on the California courts, was a member of your board in the same building. And I waited and waited, the phone never rang. So then I decided I had to take drastic action. I left the court, have now joined the Carnegie Endowment, and I've been invited to speak here. So I feel good. It's progress. I'm an action-oriented person. I am, on this very cold day in Los Angeles, it is a great honor to speak to you. I want to take maybe 3 or 4 minutes to sketch out a few themes that are on my mind about California and its relationship to the global context we live in, and then maybe just spend a minute or two telling you about the Carnegie Endowment, what we do, why we do it, and then I look forward to the conversation. So I moved to California as a 14-year-old in 1987. When I arrived in California, in many ways, it was what it is today. It was a beautiful state, diverse state, complex, networked into the global economy, big defense industry back then, already a powerhouse in media, not yet what it is today in technology, huge agricultural superpower. With 1% of our economy dedicated to agriculture here, we produce more than Iowa. And as a kid moving to Calexico, California, I didn't know what to expect exactly, but I knew when I arrived that I was entering what was going to be probably the most important phase in my life, and it would be connected to California in some way. I didn't know how exactly. What struck me growing up on the border is that California had a scale and a degree of diversity and a complexity that made it a global player. And I didn't exactly know how to say that as a 14 or 15-year-old, but it struck me that that was a fact. And I wanted it to be part of my journey to understand that better over time. Looking back now, I see a state that has had many challenges, has made some wrong turns at different moments, but there are three things about it that strike me as really crucial to understanding California's global role. The first is that California had this massive development phase that came after World War II that characterized some of the most interesting things happening in America. There was a lot of movement from elsewhere in America here to California. There was a huge moment of investment in infrastructure around water, roads, the University of California system. Many states followed our lead. There was for a while neglect to certain issues like environmental protection, air quality, but California too began to lead. That was not always an easy process. It was a costly process. It was one that was led not only by Sacramento, but reflected what was happening in cities like LA. And today, we are very much the beneficiaries of decisions that were made 50, 60 years ago on this score. As a kid growing up in Calexico, my dream was to attend the University of California, San Diego. I still admire that institution like I do many others, including UCLA, USC. But that literally motivated me in a way that is hard to fully describe. So all these investments that we made had subtle effects and consequences to this day. The second thing that is striking to me about California is that, so there I was, my second, third year probably as a justice in Sacramento for the State of the State address, which still, gets my heart racing when you get into that legislative chamber, the governor comes out. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter at all what he says, but you get caught up in the moment, and sometimes it can be a little long and drone on a bit, and you don't pay attention to everything. But what struck me in talking to people who are Republicans, Democrats, shaking their hands, is that across the state, there's a relative degree of embrace of a diversity that we have here that has been difficult to come by in other states in the country, and reflects the reality that the world has come to California. That has made this place more complicated, but also much more interesting. As a justice, I dealt with the challenge of trying to make our courts more accessible to people who don't speak English. And that isn't just to make it easier for them to litigate cases, it's also because these are often the witnesses in criminal cases that end up being critical in providing testimony. And what I found dealing with this issue is that we don't speak 10 languages in California, we speak 200 languages. There are more Californians who speak limited, who are limited in their English capabilities than in New York and Texas combined. And if you actually add New York, Texas, and Florida together, that's about as many limited English speakers as we have in California. That's despite the investment we make in community colleges and adult education and so on. It's not always been easy, but that embrace of diversity reflects to some degree the reality that California and the country are a hub for the entire global economy. And the third point, and the last point I'll make for the moment, is that we have embraced a global role. We've done that in two ways. Partly by shaping policy in a way that is designed to impact what happens outside of California. Think emissions controls, think climate change, but also by understanding that trade is an absolutely critical part of our economy. That agricultural economy I mentioned, places like the Central Valley or Calexico where I grew up, they don't function without some robust link to the world. And in this respect, California sometimes feels very far away from Washington, 3,000 miles away, and at a time when the discourse in Washington sometimes emphasizes perhaps less the interdependence of this country with the rest of the world, the importance of that robust connection to global trade. It feels like California's in a very different place. Very briefly, how does that relate to what I do in my day job? Andrew Carnegie was a penniless immigrant who came to the United States at age 13, worked his way up to the point where he owned most of the steel mills in Pennsylvania, at least in Pittsburgh, and grew them into a giant company that attracted the attention of J.P. Morgan. When Carnegie sold his business empire to J.P. Morgan, that made him briefly the wealthiest person in the world. If you take his wealth at that point in adjusted dollars and project it to what it would be now, he was richer than Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates combined. I say he was briefly the richest man in the world because he started promptly to give his money away. He was obsessed with education, which is something I know you and I are interested in. He built thousands of libraries all over the US. He was very interested in science and its role, set up institutions to do research on biology, geology, physics. But he was most concerned about peace and war. He was actually kind of obsessed with that. And his goal was to try to use some of his wealth to build an institution that could work towards global peace by building relationships and developing knowledge, by analyzing what was happening in the world and helping to chart a path forward for more cooperation and less war. Naively, he thought that war could be ended in about 10 years if the world did the right thing and built institutions to have, adjudication of disputes abroad. In this respect, he was wrong. But I don't believe he was wrong in thinking that ideas, knowledge, and relationships could make the world more peaceful and more secure. Obviously, we're not doing great in some respects. My wife likes to point out that since I started the Carnegie Endowment 4 months ago, things have gotten worse. I'd like to think that's not the only measure of whether we're making progress, but I won't sugarcoat this. We are an American institution, but almost half of our employees are actually not American. They're working in places like Brussels, but also more interesting, complicated places like New Delhi, Beirut, Beijing, and Moscow. So you can imagine how that has stressed our organization today. But we're going to soldier on. We're going to keep on going. We're going to keep on doing track 2 diplomacy. We're going to keep on informing policymakers. We're going to keep on putting ideas out there that will try to move the world in the right direction. And I look forward to having a conversation about all of that. Thank you.
Fantastic. If you don't mind, I want to go back to the announcement of your appointment. And it included a very, very specific and unusual promise, which was that the first thing you wanted to do was to open a Silicon Valley office. So I was interested in our conversation on California, what a Silicon Valley office does for Carnegie that Washington D.C. can't, or the other essentially how is it different, or what does it share with your long-standing regional centers? So I wonder if you could talk a little about that.
So we think about it more as a California office now, and it's really still largely on the drawing board. We do have a little beachhead in Silicon Valley now, a little bit of office space. We have one scholar we've hired already who's an expert on Asia political economy. He works on global Japan, among other things, and the links between Japan and the US that don't just have to do with security. Talk about a lot of the interesting tech sector innovation in Japan is happening not in the companies that face consumers, but in companies that are sort of upward of the supply chain that deal with industrial equipment, drones, construction, etc. We have a scholar that we've just hired that does the Middle East, and he's going to lead our Middle East program, which is based in DC. But he's starting in Silicon Valley. He has some robust connections to the tech sector there, trying to engage in how some of our technology infrastructure could be used to make democracy a little bit easier to achieve, to deal with some of the governance challenges they have in the region. Over time, we hope that this will be a hub that has a base in Southern California as well, an office here too. And I think the short answer is we have been 112 years operating almost entirely in national capitals. Not all in the US, but whether it's Brussels or New Delhi, we're talking about places where the national policymakers meet and decide. And important though that is, what all of us who are Californians by vocation know is that policy decisions that affect the world are being made outside of national capitals in vital regions like this. So some of that innovation and dynamism, I think, is going to be crucial for our mission.
So I also want to ask a little bit about the decision to leave the court. With a few notable exceptions, most California Supreme Court justices served for decades. And you have certainly had a terrific experience on the court, but you decided to take this opportunity. And I wonder if I'm guessing that it wasn't the headhunter called and said, gee, do you know that thinly veiled, gee, do you know someone who might be interested? So I'm genuinely curious and wondered if you could talk a little bit about the process of leaving the court, making the decision, what you were hoping to do, other than to have the invitation, of course, to speak to the August Pacific Council. What was sort of driving your decision making?
We got to put the Pacific Council in there somewhere. So just inside my former chambers in the Supreme Court building in San Francisco, there's a metal plaque, and it lists all the justices who have held my seat since it was created. The Supreme Court of California began with 3 justices. They decided that wasn't enough to really have the robust arguments and disagreements they felt California merited, so they went to 5. Then they went to 7. So since there was, I think my seat goes back to when it went from 3 to 5, and there was a name on that plaque, Frank Kerrigan, I think, who had been on the court for 2 years. And I looked into this, and he was extremely prolific. He wrote like 2,000 opinions not 2,000, but like over 1,000 opinions in 2 years. Most of them were dissents, and then he left the court. I actually think this was in the early days of retention elections, and he was not retained. So I thought if I can last longer than Frank Kerrigan, I'm already in a good place. But it was a very difficult decision. I'll tell you 3 things that are really great about being on the Supreme Court. You get up every morning and you work for the people of California. You're in an institution that largely works, and not to cast any aspersions on our national Supreme Court, but I'll just note, we work hard to agree as much as we can on the California Supreme Court. And when we disagree, the 4-3 splits or 5-2 splits don't always track like the party of the governor who appointed you. And people work hard. And when issues get to the court and we decide something that interprets a statute in a particular way and the legislature doesn't love it, they can change the law, and they do so sometimes. So the privilege of working in an institution that pretty much works pretty well was great. That's not always been the case. If you go back in history and look at the 70s, the 80s, the court was so polarized that sometimes the justice could barely be in the same room at the same time. The third great thing about it is you get to work out your brain. You work on so many different issues: land use, water, climate change, taxation, criminal justice, and so on. So given all that, why did I go? So
that's what we're wondering.
Yeah, the short answer is I started at the court having come from running the Freeman Spogli Institute, where I worked on issues like food security, migration, global governance, democracy. And I loved my time at the court, but those issues never entirely left my mind. And as I made it through my years at the court, I realized that there were things showing up in my docket, wildfires and climate change, just to give you one example, oceans, that had this big global context. And I thought, maybe part of what I can do is to take what I'm learning here in California and apply it in a global context. But the right job would have to come along. And so when that discussion began, and I thought, the likelihood they'll think that this is doable from California is not so high. And when they went for that, I was a little surprised. And so here we are.
Fantastic. I want to ask you, because you mentioned this, that one of the things that you've been grappling with is having the global centers, and that's been a hallmark of Carnegie and how it operates. And obviously a lot of time and attention is being paid to Ukraine. One thing I know from my time at RAND is that a lot of Sovietologists changed their fields in the 90s. There was precious little for them to do. They went off and found new things to do, whether it was domestic or another regional expertise. Carnegie stayed invested in Russia, and obviously that's incredibly important today. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the longstanding investment and what it's like to run a Moscow center in March of 2022.
Thank you. You're very right. And Andrew Weiss, our vice president who works on Russia and Eurasia, actually has ties to Southern California. He's from here. He describes what it was like to grow up at a time when the Soviet Union still existed. And he was just fascinated by the politics, the decision-making in the Kremlin, how that had an effect on the world. And, we look at Russia now, and we can say with confidence, even well before the Ukraine stuff broke out, you're looking at the country with the most nuclear weapons in the world, the largest wheat exporter in the world, place with millions of acres of permafrost that are melting, and as they do, they're having a massive potential impact on climate change. Huge role in the fossil fuel economy. Like, if you want to tell any story where we scrape by on climate over the next 20 to 25 years, even the next 10 years, which are so critical on this issue, that doesn't have some story to tell about Russia, hard to see that, right? Russia's role in the global economy and the illicit economy, all of that highlights for us why it was the right thing to stay invested in that. We've had a Moscow Center since 1992-93. Think about the tumult in Russia at that time. To my mind, it was quite a visionary decision of my predecessors to put a center there to try to move the model of a think tank that is intellectually honest, that is directly working on issues that have long-term impact. And our scholars to this day are trying to give some real insight into what's happening in Ukraine. Now, two points further about that. One is, I think this really tells a larger story about the Carnegie Endowment. We're not just about the quick hit. We're not about the issue of the moment. We're trying to take a long-term perspective on things and learning from Andrew Carnegie's overconfidence about when war can be banished. We kind of know some of these issues are going to have to stay with us. And then second, it's been quite challenging to create a good balance there for our scholars who are obviously in a really tricky and complex situation, but they also believe in our mission and they think it's important for the world to understand what's happening in Russia. So we're going to try to take it day by day. My great hope is that we'll continue to be able to operate there, not because it's easy, but because at a time like this when it's particularly important for the US and Europe to understand how people see the world from Russia's perspective and also to be able to share ideas in that context.
So I want to ask, I'm torn between two questions. So I'm gonna ask because I think you brought up all the ingredients that are present in Russia, and ask about China, where you also have a center, and ask if there are things that your scholars are concerned about or activated on, because to me, so many of the ingredients of Russia, including an authoritarian leader who has established a life tenure and control of media channels, etc. So much is there that's also present in China. So just curious to hear what's bubbling up there and how you're doing with your scholars there.
So China is perhaps the most incredibly consequential story. The development of China, the changes in China in the late 20th, early 21st century. It is a truly staggering thing even to see the changes in 20 years, 15 years there. And as an institution that had the mission of trying to understand better how the world could achieve better cooperation and avoid conflict, we could not be in Asia. And we understood that part of the role that we needed to play there is to try to create a robust understanding between scholars in China, scholars in the US, reaching out to young ambassadors. We have, Chinese young students who take an opportunity to get involved with us. Also, frankly, to help get the American perspective into kind of discussions when it came to universities and whatnot. And what we found in recent years is that as the US and China have become more polarized, frankly, the work we're trying to do there in some ways has become more important. Hasn't become easier to do, but I'll just highlight one particular aspect of it. You look at our scholars and what they do, and sometimes you see them quoted in the news, that you see them, appearing on PBS, but a lot of what our scholars do is behind the scenes. They're briefing policymakers, they're having quiet dialogues, they're bringing together unofficial participants in dialogues that can shape the agenda for relations between countries. And the track 2 type dialogues we have in the China context have been really especially important for us. So we're trying to take the long view here. At the end of the day, whether it's climate or economic dislocation or changes in Africa or dealing with artificial intelligence, there's probably going to be a need for the US and China to communicate, even if they're not always going to see eye to eye. And so, there too, we're taking it day by day. I'm optimistic that we'll continue to be able to do work in China, but it's probably going to be a different climate in the next 10 years than it was in the last 10 years.
So not to put too fine a point on it, but I one of the questions I did have is, how are you feeling about Track 2 in 2022? It's been such an important investment, and you've had the pillars of research and analysis and relationship building, and they too have been a consistent part of Carnegie and its strategy. And just sort of, how are you feeling about it, because you're much closer to it?
I take a venture capital approach to this. I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to be in 5 or 6 or 8 or 12 of these dialogues, and 2 or 3 of them might have a really huge payoff. The rest will have some payoff. But I do think one thing we've learned as an institution is it's rarely the case that you succeed with these dialogues if you have like an 18-month or 12-month time horizon. We have one particular practitioner of this, Suzanne DiMaggio, who's really terrific, who's worked on issues with Iran, for example, for 15, 18, 20 years. And sometimes you really have to take that time horizon. So as I think about the China piece of this, I think there are going to be some issues in the next few months and years that are going to be so tricky. South China Sea, cross-strait relations, issues involving technology. But there are going to be some other things that should not be quite so difficult. You know, at the end of the day, do we have common interests in removing space debris that are going to have a real impact on the space industry? Absolutely. Do we have common interests in trying to do AI research in a way that preserves safety concerns? Do we have interest in trying to promote economic growth and development in Southeast Asia, one of the most dynamic regions of the world? Absolutely. So my hope is that we can make sure that these relationships don't close off completely. Let me just give you one example of how historically that played out in the context of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. At the height of the Cold War, I am struck by how scientists and even military officials on both sides would meet to talk about nuclear safety. That is not a small thing. And when I look back and think about all the things that went right and not things went wrong over the Cold War, it does seem to me that that set of dialogues definitely helped.
I'm looking to see if folks are warm enough to start asking questions. So I'll give you a second to think about your questions. I will let you know, because it's been a minute since we've all been together in these settings, that when you have a question, I will put my glasses back on and call on you. A microphone will magically appear nearby you. And you are welcome to introduce yourself and share your name. And formulate a question, not a musing or a statement, but a question. So I'm gonna look out and take a quick pause and see if we have anybody who is feeling brave enough to live by those rules.
While you're doing that, I'll just note it really is a joy to be in an in-person event. Thank you for coming out. It means a lot to me.
Right.
My name's Bennett Ramberg. You have a Carnegie office in Moscow, and I wanted to know, what information are you receiving from that office bearing on current events in Ukraine?
Thank you. So we have both a Carnegie office in Moscow as well as a set of scholars based in DC that work on Russia and Eurasia. And from both of them, we get the sense that the situation is more dire than people might have expected, even when they expected that there would be war, that the sanctions have had a more intense and pronounced effect, that the extent of concern about civilians, or at least the possibility that this will affect a very large number of civilians, is more pronounced. I think there is a remarkable coming together of the Western alliance in Europe, a remarkable reversal of policy in Germany that has been quite captivating and interesting to people in both our Eurasia program in DC as well as our Moscow scholars. I think it's fair to say that there's a concern that there's no easy way to ratchet this down, that the likely dynamic will be one of risk of escalation. And certainly the actions of the European Union have been pretty unprecedented, actually paying for weapons. Certainly Germany supporting the Ukrainians with Stinger missiles. We just had not seen that or expected that before. I think one of the biggest variables and questions will be how these sanctions play out for the Russian people over the next few months and years, perhaps. There was a big push to digitize the payments economy in Russia, just to give one small example, where if you think about the situation in the 1990s in Moscow compared to today, all kinds of payments are now digital. It's almost like being in LA or Silicon Valley, where there's like electronic payments and there's very little cash in the economy. That has actually created almost more of a vulnerability to these disruptions that are coming from sanctions that are probably more severe than the regime was expecting. You know, It's a really unusual situation, I must say. Some of our scholars have, traveled elsewhere, and right now I would say as a general matter, we're keeping a close eye on the situation. We want to make sure our people are safe, but we're also trying to study how this is playing out in different regions of the world. India, just to make one more observation, and this is very much on the minds of Russian folks because Russia has often kept track of India and tried to think of it as a potential ally in a whole bunch of issues with respect to interacting with NATO and the West, as it were. But I think that there has been a backlash and a reaction in that region and that country that has taken the Russians by surprise as well. These are some of the things we're hearing.
If you don't mind, I was just going to interject, and just as you were talking about this, I was realizing when you were on the court, would you mind sharing with folks the sort of size of your chambers and staff? I think it would be an interesting counterpoint to what you have going on today, needing to worry about human beings in all corners of
That's
the world.
Fair. So as a justice of the Supreme Court, I had a staff of 6 people who worked for me. They were terrific. I had a team of maybe 12 to 15 people that I also interacted with on the language access issues. I traveled all up and down the state, obviously trying to keep track of a system that was very broad and complex. But most of the action in our judiciary works at the trial court level, obviously. We have courts like Los Angeles that are so big, have so many judges, that most countries in the world have fewer judges than just the LA Superior Court. And that's true about the LA Superior Court compared to states, too. At the Carnegie Endowment, I have hundreds of colleagues in 5 global centers, and then, of course, DC. And then we have 20 countries where our scholars are located. We have about 150 scholars. So just keeping track of what's happening operationally is very, very different.
Little different from
Yeah,
having
for sure.
to get the chance to bring your
Yeah,
entire
I mean, not to
staff
mention,
in.
like, I used to teach international law, but it's one thing to teach international law in the classroom. It's another thing to have to deal with different accounting standards, different rules governing nonprofit organizations, different, like, legal personalities that our institutions actually have across borders, different HR policies around different countries in the world.
We've got a question in the back.
Tino, thank you for coming again. And one question I have in terms of the endowments, is there opportunity for young people? Because it's, the young people are our future. And is there any kind of programming things to engage young people to expand their minds to think more globally than locally?
Great question. Thank you so much. We are very lucky that for some years now we've had a Junior Fellows program that goes after the brightest young minds we can find in America who want a career as scholar practitioners dealing with something global. Doesn't have to be international security or international trade or business or nonprofit or academia. It can be all of those, right? But if you're globally minded and you're a young mind and you want to go far, we look for you. We have about 20 of these folks a year. I would love to have twice as many. I'd actually love to have a network of these folks around the world in our offices, like in Beirut, imagine, in New Delhi, in Brussels, if we found cohorts of these folks who could work together. We already are moving a little in that direction with our Young Ambassadors program that we've had in our Beijing office. We look to expand this for sure. Second way that we're trying to go after this is I'm trying to use our young global junior fellows as a sounding board to see how some of our programming that happens digitally, our convenings, our speakers, our events can actually be more appealing and engaging to young people. They are absolutely the future, as you say. And even if I just take one aspect of our mission, which is America's global role, how does America play the role it can and should play in the world? That's going to require like a generation-long commitment. So we want to find these people. We want to support them. We want your help in doing so as well. One of the reasons I want to set up this robust presence in California is also to have interns in California. So think about what these young kids in LA could do if they get the chance to work with us, to take part in these Track 2 dialogues, to learn about the Middle East, about Russia, about China. So I would love, like, whenever I leave this job, which hopefully will not be for a while, but when I do, I would love to have people say, Cuellar, he came in, he loved the Track 2 dialogues, he loved the role of like expanding knowledge, but he was really passionate about the younger generation and getting them more involved in the work that we're doing. We might even design a video game at some point, but we got to work up to that.
Wow. We have a gentle person in front.
Tino, I'm remiss in not having called you when you were on the Supreme Court, and so the court's loss is Carnegie's gain. I wanted to ask your thoughts about the rise of authoritarianism in the world. And in recent years, democracy has been under attack in many ways, including the sense that it doesn't work as well as it ought to have or used to. What, in your view, are efforts that we can do to reassert the confidence in democracies around the world, and how would Carnegie play a role in doing that?
Gabe, thank you. That's a powerful and important issue. The first thing we can do is be intellectually honest and recognize that it's a fact that democracy is under siege. That's true in part because countries that do not have a democratic tradition or capacity have become bolder, more brazen, in just speaking out and suggesting that democracy is pretty bankrupt and doesn't work. And it's on us in part to prove them wrong. I think it's also, frankly, because from within, democracy, when practiced robustly, always has a degree of instability built into it. We don't do democracy because it's easy. We don't do democracy because it's convenient. We don't do democracy because it always gives you the right answer. We have much deeper reasons for democracy. I would say two stand out to my mind. One is that we believe democracy is rooted in morality and ethics. And I think most people who practice democracy, whether it's in Europe or in Kenya or in the US or in Latin America, they'll kind of agree that there's a moral and ethical piece to it. We also do democracy because we rightly sometimes fear the really dark side of really efficient government. Judith Shklar, who was a remarkable academic and actually was my professor, who sadly died about 3 weeks after she taught the class that I took with her when I was an undergrad. She has written so beautifully about this in an essay called The Liberalism of Fear. And she's using the term liberalism not to mean like left-right, but like the liberal tradition in political theory of like understanding the role of the individual and the importance of the individual. She's somebody whose family fled the advance of Nazi Germany a bit before it came, not quite when World War II broke out, but a little bit before. She went to Canada and then ended up in the US. And she spoke about this with such sadness and eloquence because she sort of talked about democracy the way you and I, as you, a current jurist, and me, a former jurist, would talk about the jury system. Do we think the jury always gets it right? Do we think that jurors are like really smart and great at everything they do? No. But do we think we can run a judicial system that is totally disconnected from the lay public? No, right? So then we ask the lay public to put up with getting summoned, with looking for parking on a crowded, difficult day when they'd rather be at work or with their kids. And we ask them to do that day after day because it matters. And I think that in the end, democracy will survive because people do not forget that responsibility is in their hearts and their minds and their actions much more than in their government or in some machinery or bureaucracy. Now, I will say this. I do think it is important to keep perspective when we think about what's difficult about democracy. Some of it is the rise of a technological infrastructure where it's incredibly easy to find people who will validate not only your beliefs about what's right and wrong, but your sense of the facts to the point that it's like completely wrong and you're living in a bubble. Some of it is that we have a tradition in this country of a legal commitment that makes it very difficult to regulate the financial and campaign contribution side of democracy, for better or not. But let us remember, if I look at any big country, so we could have a discussion about Singapore or Denmark, but these places have less than half the population of LA County, okay? So if I talk about any country at scale, any country with 50, 100, 200 million people, 300 million people, 1 billion people, I don't think any country at scale has managed to figure out the secret sauce for governing effectively, democratic or authoritarian, in a system with as many disruptions as we've had. I think that is almost encouraging to me as a little d-Democrat because it means that for all the difficulties we're having right now with democracy in countries from Kenya to India to the United States, we're not alone. We're actually living in a society where governing effectively, dealing with the climate crisis, governing technology, delivering clean water to people, building infrastructure is actually very, very challenging. So I would say getting a handle on the technology stuff, making sure the norms don't decay, and making sure we keep some perspective. Last thing on perspective, I'll say, I grew up in northern Mexico, and I learned a lot of great things from my peers and from my context and environment. But I do think that apropos of this institution, what it does, I think many Americans also fail to reflect a little bit on how chaotic, how violent, how difficult, and how arbitrary life can be in a lot of places, even pretty close to our country. And that doesn't mean we've got everything figured out or solved, or we don't have problems with the police, and we don't have problems with corruption. But putting it in perspective globally gives us at least an appreciation for what we've achieved.
If you don't mind if I follow up on that, because you have such a unique background in that you have run an academic institution focused on international policy. You have worked with the Domestic Policy Council at the White House and chaired a Commission on Equity and Educational Excellence at the U.S. Department of Education. So as you think about these issues, what role does Carnegie and what role does education in the United States and that focus on youth? You've talked about wanting more young people involved in what you're doing, but to what extent should or could you be thinking about the education of young Americans as part of your effort to fulfill Andrew Carnegie's vision of hastening the end of war?
Thank you. There are two parts to that. So one role that we have is to educate the public. We don't treat that as our primary or only mission. A lot of the work we do is behind the scenes. Our policymakers get briefings from Carnegie scholars. We do the Track 2 dialogue. We do reports and analyses that are calculated, that they're not going to be page turners for everybody, although we do try to make them readable. But there is a quarter, a third of our work that is about educating the public. We can do better. And to put it on us to some degree, I think that our vision at Carnegie is to do this better with young people than we have in the past. Right now, if I say Carnegie Endowment, like 20-somethings-year-olds have no conception of what we do. And that's partly a problem for us. I think if you're a young person at Cal State or at Pomona College or Claremont McKenna or USC, you should know about the Carnegie Endowment. You should go to our videos on hypersonic missiles to understand what that technology is going to do to the arms race. You should have a sense of how Europe is dealing with climate change in Africa by providing aid and how perfect or imperfect that is. But the other piece goes to something deeper that it unites you and me in terms of our passion for K-12 education. Even if we do our job very well at Carnegie, there is a larger story about what's happening in K-12 education in America, and it is not a very happy story. It has some good points, but fundamentally, I think for too long, we've been too satisfied that the schools that are not in distress are doing pretty well, when in fact, even the schools that are not in distress are not competitive globally, and the schools that are in distress, and there are many, are left to deal with teacher pay issues, with just like pulling together a curriculum that is often not well adapted to the kids, that doesn't fully grapple with the dramas that are playing out in local communities and families. And I do think that amidst all those challenges, K-12 education has to deliver a civic participation message that goes to what Gabe and I were just talking about. But it also has to equip people to be really productive in a global economy where if you're not part of the global economy, you're almost for sure like in trouble. And that's a really different position to be in relative to 30, 40 years ago when we were not competing with, Thailand and Malaysia and Mexico as much as we are with China and Germany.
That's I could go on that, but I want to make sure if we've got more audience questions that I'm giving you an opportunity to sneak your hands in the air. We've got one over to the far corner.
I'm glad to see questions from the audience, by the way, because I used to be a law professor and I could still call on people, but I don't think I'll be too.
Hello there. Thank you so much again for being here. I'm wondering, how has technology changed the way you do your job? Has it had negative consequences, positive consequences? And then also, how can we support your endowment?
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Technology is affecting both the way we do our work as well as the subjects of the work we do, because technology is sort of both pulling the world together and tearing it apart at the same time, really. So I would say when I took this job, I studied the history of the organization, and I found that a little bit before my time, a little bit before even my wonderful Vice President, Allison Roush, who's here and helps me with the second part of your question of how we can be supported. A little bit before we arrived, a wonderful communications director named Jen Psaki, who worked at the Carnegie Endowment before her current job, came in and realized that the vast majority of what our scholars did had life in print publications. There were books, there were journal articles, there were reports that you could get mailed to you. There were, briefings that would be printed out and given to people. And she pushed us to a digital-first strategy, which has been absolutely critical. I mean, how in the world can we engage with the Middle East, with, India, China in the same way if we're not digital? COVID accelerated that massively. So now we're facing the dilemma that many other organizations, including this one, are facing about how do you keep some of what we learned in the pandemic to work remotely more effectively, to reach larger audiences, but still to have the dynamic that we can have here. Briefly on how it's changed the subject of our work, we run what is arguably one of the most important technology summits in the world from our New Delhi office, the Global Technology Summit, because that's an example of where we see technology both capable of really building robust links around the world in terms of supply chains, in terms of digital information sharing, digital trade, but also even if you don't get into armaments, technology is providing the tools of surveillance for authoritarian regimes. It is creating new forms of weaponry. It is putting our infrastructure at risk through cybersecurity issues. So I would say now easily a third of our work has some connection to technology. Finally, we depend on support from people who look at our ideas, go on our website, sign up for Carnegie This Week, which reaches tens of thousands of people. Honestly, as an endowment, we do draw some of our funding from an internal endowment, but a little over half of our money comes from contributions and donations. Right now, in particular, if you ask me where we have the biggest need, our Russia team is working 24/7. And when I think about how that work can be extended, brought to different countries around the world, how people in need who have been part of our program can be helped in different ways, we always welcome the support.
I look forward to reporting that back to Andrew Weiss. I wanted to ask you, because shortly, probably about the same time that the invitation to today's conversation was distributed to the Pacific Council, Governor Newsom named his nominee to succeed you on the court. It happens to be a law school classmate of mine, which makes being old enough to have a classmate on the California Supreme Court palatable if you really, really like and admire them, which I do. And I was curious if you had any advice for Trish Guerrero as she gets ready to step into the chambers that you led.
So first of all, California's in for a treat. Trish is wonderful. She's Justice Guerrero, I should say. She's thoughtful, she's grounded, she's insightful. She gets that part of the job is to build consensus. Frankly, part of the job is to be out there and connect with people outside the four walls of the court. The court can be very isolating if you don't push against it affirmatively. I also should point out, by the way, that as somebody who was a Calexico high school bulldog, I'm very proud of the fact that she also has roots in the Imperial Valley and is from Southern California originally. So that's all great. I would say three things about how the job might be well done. The first is don't get hung up on any one case. The weird thing is when I first joined the court, the first 4 cases I worked on, because they all hit me at the same time. There was one big case about CEQA and the environment, one massive case about gang conspiracies, one about policing, and one about tort law or something. Those were the most important cases in the universe for me. And I kept on thinking in my mind, I didn't realize this at first, I had this secret fear that as soon as I finished working on those 4 cases, I'd be hit by a bus and die. And those would be the only cases I'd ever work on in my life. So I wanted to make sure I got everything I wanted in those cases. They were totally right from my perspective. One of my staff who'd been at the court a while, he smartly said, don't get hung up on any one case. Obviously, you want to get it right, but you're going to work on hundreds of cases. You're going to vote on thousands of matters. That's actually you know that in your brain, but it's hard to fully accept in your heart. Second, I think it's a job that benefits from a lot of robust social relationships with the people you're working with all the time. You're sitting around the table with 6 very smart people who are voting with you every week on what cases to grant review on, and they can be about child abuse, the cases, or they can be about, big infrastructure projects, or about like why, San Diego built a baseball stadium in some place. And you get to know them as well as anyone, maybe except your spouse. And if you don't also find some way of like having a little banter with them and getting to know what food they like it's just like not as much fun. And then third, get out of the court. And I think this is something Trish will do naturally. When I joined the court, I was shortly on a ballot for the state of California for retention. And that is the scariest thing probably I ever experienced in my professional life. Because even though I knew it was a up-down vote, like no one was running against me, and I knew the likelihood that I was going to get retained was about 99.9%. Having your name on the ballot messes with your brain. It actually gave me more insight into stuff happening in DC too. And what I noticed is the night of the vote, I was up until 3 a.m. watching the returns, very happy to see that LA County gave me 77% of the vote. But Modoc County gave me like 44% of the vote. And even though Modoc County has like 10,000 people, I wanted to go to Modoc County the next day and talk to them and tell them like, I'm not that bad, get to know me. But that underscored for me some of the job really is trying to help people understand, what does this institution do? Why do we do what we do? Why are we set up this way? Like trying to be ambassadors for the state of California.
Fantastic. We've got a question in the far corner, so we're gonna.
And we have a question over here.
Thank you so much for this. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the endowment's role with Web3 and cryptocurrency and the metaverse, and obviously, you're setting up a footprint in Silicon Valley / California, which is not an accident by any means. So where you see your role in that?
Thank you. There are 2 ways that we can help on all those developments, and we're watching them with interest. We don't pretend that we know exactly what's going to happen with Web3, metaverse, or AI for that matter, which is an issue that's been of interest to me since before I was a judge. And actually, I spent quite a bit of time thinking about it on the court in terms of how it relates to our judiciary and all that. One role is to think about how the developments in these areas intersect with geopolitics, with our relationships with Asia and South Asia and Europe in particular, perhaps, how these developments might affect Africa, which will soon have the plurality of the global workforce and is adding 21 million people to cities every single year. So that is taking us in some interesting directions. We think that there are some great opportunities for good trade and technology development partnerships. We think there's some great opportunities for certain really important economies that are important for themselves and for the US, like Taiwan, to develop on this score. We've put out some reports on that score. We think the world has some things to learn from South Korea, where there's an incredibly robust digital infrastructure. But the other way is we realize that with every major technological shift, there has been progress for humanity and also headaches. And the headaches are not small. And I would say, I would love to see Carnegie's role as how do you minimize the headaches while increasing the promise, the positivity. And so on that score, a good framework for what we would like to do with these new issues would be the role we are currently playing with respect to social media and the existing internet infrastructure. And I can sum that up by highlighting about something you and I were just starting to talk about a little earlier, which is PCIO, the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations. So social media by its nature is neither good nor bad. It's a way of connecting people, a way of building connections in the world. But can it be used to inflame public opinion with things that are not facts? Absolutely. Can it be used to divide? Can it be used to spread dissent and disagreement, to weaken democracy? Absolutely. In order to counter that, we need more than just goodwill. We need knowledge of how influence operations play out in real time, as close to real time as possible. Now, one way to do that, of course, is to partner with technology companies, and sometimes they can be terrific partners, but for understandable reasons, they're sometimes not going to be like, oh, well, here's all our data. You know, they'll have legitimate and commercial reasons why they sometimes don't want to do that. So part of what we need to achieve is the building out of a digital technology infrastructure that can help us harvest data from the web, from the public web, to better track and understand the way influence operations play out, both in walled gardens and on the web writ large. And what we're finding is there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of computing infrastructure you need, a lot of scholars you can bring together. And this has implications not only for the US, but for geopolitical regions that are on the front line of like really being disrupted by cyber attacks and by these influence operations like Eastern Europe and Taiwan, et cetera. And so we're very interested in trying to further develop those kinds of projects. And they're going to have analogs for the metaverse and for Web3.
Well, I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and ask one wrap-up question, and it's not going to be a tough one. Carnegie has been a force since 1910, and if I asked you to pick one thing, where would you like to take them that they haven't been in 112 years?
To California, but I would say that's part of it. And the rest of my answer follows a little bit from that. I was just talking to somebody who said to me that one thing that your mayor likes to point out sometimes is that LA is like the future only sooner. And that is mostly a good thing, but it's not always an uncomplicated thing. The future, and I think this is true for California at large. California is like a snapshot of where the world is going to be in 20 plus years. And we are a place of community. We're a place where people across the spectrum understand the value of diversity. We're a place where we bring the best and brightest minds and they work in our universities. We're a place where we're innovative, but we're also a place of wildfires. You know, it takes 20 years to build infrastructure. We're grappling with a variety of issues involving housing and equality. Right, so I would say, if I take that point and generalize it to Carnegie, I think one real source of great excellence we have is we have incredibly thoughtful people who are able to translate complex ideas into a 5-month time horizon. In other words, the difference between my colleagues at Stanford and my colleagues at Carnegie is that at Stanford, a professor is content to say, I study geopolitics and where we might be in 20 years. That's important. But my Carnegie colleagues are like, I study geopolitics and what can we do about it in the next 5 months? But I see an opportunity there, and it partly runs through California, it's partly broader, to have Carnegie be in a more productive dialogue between the 5-month time horizon and the 20-year time horizon. And just to give you 2 areas where that is really crucial, Africa and climate. So climate, we're going to decide in the next 8 to 10 years whether we scrape by or whether we have to really focus on adaptation and the security consequences that are coming that we will not be able to avoid. That takes some imagining of how our economy works, the circular economy, sustainability, the technology piece, how we bring in the global south at a time when billions of people want to be in the middle class and we're telling them, well, that's fine, but we're now going to have to limit energy production. So how do we get that to happen in a peaceful way? And then Africa is an extraordinary story. It's really the part of the geopolitical landscape that is still growing population-wise, almost the only part. And I think a lot of the future of war and peace will depend on how it goes in Africa as they add to their urban population and need to find an economic model that works long-term.
Well, thank you. Thank you for great questions. Thank you for hanging in there and staying warm enough to be with us, and just so grateful. And Jerry, I think you were going to offer a few.
A final. Is this thing working? Oh, a final. Lindsey, you look really, really cold.
I'm good.
Just for our members, I'm going to tell you 3 tiny Carnegie stories, really short. When Eric Garcetti was nominated ambassador to India, I called him and I said, you need to call Ashley Tellis at the Carnegie Endowment, who was an advisor to a prior American ambassador to India. When the Pacific Council sent a delegation to Moscow, we went and were briefed by Dmitry Trainin, the Carnegie Moscow office. A friend of mine is doing business in Libya. Where do I find somebody who knows Libya? I said, call Fred Wary at the Carnegie Endowment. So Carnegie really is, and I'm not on the payroll, but it's sort of a national treasure available to all of us. The fact that at the helm is somebody who cares about California, I think is enormously important. And just to give you a heads up, Tino, the Pacific Council is going to offer you a little bit of office space on the house in Los Angeles, because I get the Valley, it's, that's fine. We're having the Olympics, we're hosting the Summit of the Americas, we're making a run at the APEC meetings, we have both of the ports, we have Hollywood, we have sports, which, sports diplomacy is huge. So it's not like, France has one city or China has one city. California has multiple cities, and given that we have the 5th largest economy in the world, it makes sense to do both. So I'm going to come see you, but we've got some space. We want to invite you. We love our peers, and we want to bring the best to California, and that's Carnegie. So thank you so much. I guarantee you've kept property here when you retire. You're gonna come back to California someday. That's inevitable.
I'm
So,
really grateful. Thank you. You're
guaranteed.
not on the payroll yet, but thank
well,
you.
thank you, and Lindsey, as always, thank you. Thank you all for coming and braving the cold.